Just in tonight, CNN learning Trump's former White House counsel told the National Archives that there were no classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. Okay, that's a very significant thing. And let me add on top of that, according to former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, there were only 12 boxes of, quote, newspaper clippings. Of course, in reality, what investigators found was much different. There were 48 boxes, 184 classified documents. That was voluntarily handed over by Trump in January. So after all these assurances were made about newspaper clippings, we got that. And then there were 38 more turned over in June. And then, of course, 103 more classified documents seized by the FBI in their search last month of Mar-a-Lago. Evan Perez is out front. So, Evan, we know what Mark Meadows said. We don't know why he said it or if he believed it. There are some questions here, but this does put the focus squarely on Mark Meadows. What more can you tell us?
Right, Aaron. It really puts the focus on what Mark Meadows said and where he learned that information from. What we previously reported is that Mark Meadows actually was trying to get Donald Trump to turn over boxes. What we're told is that this conversation that you just talked about is Gary Stern from the National Archives was communicating with Patrick Philbin, who's a former deputy White House counsel, and what he was passing on from Mark Meadows was that there were only about a dozen boxes and there were newspaper clippings. What we're told, our Jamie Gangel got this reporting. She's told by sources that the National Archives knew that there were records missing, and so they didn't take that to be the final answer. What they understood the conversation to be is, well, you should keep looking because we know that there are records missing. And of course, as you pointed out from that graphic you just showed us, there were tons of more government records. There are thousands of pages of government records and, of course, hundreds of pages of classified documents, Aaron.
All right, Evan, thank you very much. So out front now, Ryan Goodman, co-editor-in-chief of Just Security and the former special counsel at the Defense Department, along with Alyssa Farah Griffin, former Trump White House communications director. Okay, thanks to both of you. Newspaper clippings, 12 boxes of those. That's what you would have found at my mother's house. Okay, newspaper clippings is, and to be specific, 12 boxes of them, or about a dozen, as Evan characterized it. So it wasn't just like, oh, I think it's newspaper clippings. It was like, it's newspaper clippings, and there's about 12 boxes. What does it tell you that Mark Meadows' description of what was actually there was so off base? By the way, we're up to now 300 classified documents, and I don't even know how many boxes, right? But he was completely wrong.
Right. So if he was off by a little, it might be explicable at some level that he made a mistake. But we really are talking about dozens of boxes and over 300 classified documents, and several of them with color-coded front covers that say secret, top secret, and the rest of it. So it's a clearly false statement that he's conveying to the National Archives. I do think he faces potentially criminal jeopardy if he did that knowingly, if he knew that what he was saying was a false statement.
Right.
But we don't know where he got the information. Maybe Trump lies to him, for example, and then he conveys that to the archives. But that's, I think, the issue for him, and I think that would be something that would be of concern for him and his lawyers.
So I want to ask you about what the implications would be of that. But Alyssa, first of all, you know him. So let's talk about this. What do you think is happening here? I mean, would he really go and represent in something so important? Just repeating what Trump said? What happened here?
So giving him the best degree of the benefit of the doubt I can give him is the final months of the Trump presidency were a very chaotic period. This is, think of January 6th on to the inauguration when he had to leave the White House. It is very possible. I don't think this is out of the realm of possibility that things were just getting thrown in boxes. I know for a fact White House staff who I still talk to who were there through the final days, there was no organization. There was no, transitioning him out of office. So there could be a level of that, but that's straining kind of. This was his chief of staff. He was tasked to oversee the archives. He was the assigned person representing NARA. So he should have known better. I do think what's interesting about this is it signals that Meadows is I think that he's probably cooperating more than we realize with the Department of Justice. Okay, so Ryan, if that's the case, that means that he is, maybe trying to make up for things like this, or, who knows, right? Do you think it's possible that he is now cooperating a lot more, maybe in part because of a statement like that, which was at best clueless and lazy and at worst a lie?
I think so. And also the fact that we haven't heard him on the airwaves trying to defend Trump or anything like it.
No.
And we know that Philbin, who's part of this set of events, is speaking to the FBI, at least in spring of this year. So the idea that at least that they wouldn't have reached out to him would stretch, the imagination. So I think that they have, in all likelihood, reached out to him. And then he's either cooperating because he's a direct witness, or he's cooperating because he has a certain level of criminal jeopardy. And the implications go beyond Mar-a-Lago, because if he is cooperating and flips, that might implicate President Trump in all sorts of things with respect to January 6th, because I think he'd be a key witness against him.
Right. It's you can't open one of these boxes now without the others.
Yes.
Right? I mean, you can't keep them separate. So Alyssa, how loyal is Mark Meadows to Trump?
I mean, I think he's very loyal. I think that's something that we've seen in, his tenure as chief of staff. But I think that any person who has a family, wants to have a future, is going to think about their legal jeopardy. And I would encourage him. I worked for Mark for many years. We were very close. If you have evidence that needs to be turned over, cooperate. It's never too late to do the right thing. And one thing I want to know is the universe of who would know about these documents at Mar-a-Lago is actually fairly small, I would guess, just having been in Trump world, who both knew what was transported from the White House and then was on property there. So I wouldn't be shocked if this, part of what led to the raid could have actually, in fact, come from Meadows.
Right. Oh, so that he could have realized, wait a minute, and to your point, maybe started, I'm going to do the right thing.
Right. That would be my best guess. And by the way, Pat Philbin, somebody who I worked with, who's a serious by the book attorney, and I think there's a reason he came out very clearly and said, I was misled on this.
Right. All right. Thank you both very much. I appreciate it.